I never told my daughter what I really kept inside Warehouse 42. When she married a slick, fast-talking gold digger who thought he could outsmart a retired old man, I made sure he would never find the key. But while I was sitting comfortably at home, nursing a glass of scotch, my warehouse manager called me in a dead panic. "Sir, your son-in-law is here. He has bolt cutters and he brought two armed men." I did not panic. I had been waiting for this exact moment, and what I did next brought his entire fake world crashing down. The clock read exactly 11:30 at night. Rain hammered down in sheets lashing hard against the thick glass windows of my house out in the Cleveland suburbs. My name is Gerald Whitaker, 70 years old, and every one of those years went into carving an industrial salvage empire out of rust, sweat, and scrap metal. Strangers glance at me these days and figure I'm just a quiet, retired widower, a man who putters around his garden and pours himself a peaceful evening scotch. What they don't see is the person who clawed through 30 years in the ruthless steel and salvage trade. I'd just settled in with a generous pour of the good stuff, the bottle I kept back, for moments worth marking, when my burner phone lit up and rattled against the walnut desk. Hardly anyone carries that number. One of the few is Ramon Estrada, a 65-year-old military veteran who has run my properties with ironclad loyalty for going on 2 decades. I lifted the phone. Ramon skipped any pleasantries. What came through was a low, graveled whisper, fighting to stay audible over the hammering rain on his end. "Mr. Whitaker, it is happening. Colt is at gate 4. I drew a long, unhurried sip, letting the slow burn travel down my throat. "Is he alone, Ramon?" "No, sir." His breath snagged as he kept going. "He has bolt cutters, and he brought company. 2 large men. They are armed. I can see the glint of handguns tucked into their waistbands. What are your orders? Do I engage? Do I trigger the silent alarms?" I pushed out of my leather chair and moved to the desk. I grabbed my iPad and tapped the screen, pulling up the hidden, high-definition surveillance feed I'd had secretly rigged weeks earlier. The image bloomed to life, punching through the black with crisp night vision. And there he stood, my son-in-law, Colt Riker, self-styled venture capitalist, a man whose suits ran more than the price of my first car, planted ankle-deep in the frozen mud of an industrial district, both hands locked around a heavy pair of iron bolt cutters. I watched the downpour flatten his carefully arranged hair against his brow. That jaw of his was working the tight telltale twitch of greed and desperation. "No, Ramon," I said, and my voice carried not one tremor. "Do not engage. Do not call the police. Pull every perimeter guard off the line, open up the outer blind spots, and give him a clean run straight to the main loading dock." Ramon held for just a sliver of a second. He'd worked alongside me long enough to know better than to second-guess my thinking. "Are you absolutely sure, sir? Those men with him look like serious trouble." "I am entirely sure," I answered, and I laid my hand gently across a framed photograph of my late wife, Lorene. "Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge, the place where the stories that matter most are the ones people almost never tell. If these stories resonate with you, I'd be grateful if you hit that subscribe button and like this one before you go. And before we get into tonight's story, drop one word in the comments, just one that describes how you're feeling right now. Whatever that word is, I have a feeling this story will speak straight to it. A quick note: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What carries the truth is the message at the heart of it. Let him cut the lock, Ramon. Let him walk right in. Tonight he digs his own grave, and I intend to watch him jump inside. I set the phone down and turned back to the screen. Out there in the dark, Colt was wrestling with the heavy chains securing the outer fence. He looked pitiful, a rat gnawing at the door of a steel trap. He had no idea what was waiting on the other side of that rusted, crumbling warehouse. In his mind, he was moments away from securing his financial future. He believed he had run circles around a clueless old man. As I watched him finally snap that first lock, something cold and hard coiled tight in my chest. To make sense of how we arrived here, my daughter's husband committing a serious felony in the dead of night. You need to go back exactly 3 months. Back to the precise moment the first seed of doubt took root. The moment I understood that something parasitic had fastened itself to my family. It was Lacey and Colt's second wedding anniversary. Lacey is my 32-year-old daughter. She is the light of my life, a warm, trusting soul who owns and runs her own boutique floral design shop. After Lorene passed, I made a silent vow at her graveside to shield our daughter from everything heartbreak, failure, and above all, men who see kindness as something to exploit. Lacey had organized a dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown to celebrate. I got there early, dressed in a simple but clean suit, content just to watch my daughter's face light up. Colt showed up 15 minutes late, loudly berating the valet, flashing that expensive watch of his, carrying himself like he owned the room. He had always put my teeth on edge. He spoke too fast, promised too much, and whenever you were talking to him, his eyes kept drifting past your shoulder to see if someone more worth his time had come through the door. We were halfway through our ribeyes when the conversation lurched somewhere unexpected. Lacey was describing a new flour supplier she'd discovered, but Colt wasn't listening. He kept tapping his fork against his water-glass eyes, sliding toward me. "So, Gerald," Colt said, leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine with a casual air. "I was driving through the industrial park the other day, scouting commercial real estate for a tech startup I'm backing. Happened to pass one of your old properties, warehouse 42, I believe it's called." I stopped chewing. I set my fork down with great deliberate care. Nothing showed on my face, but inside every alarm I owned went off at once. I had never breathed a word about my business holdings to Colt. I had never so much as mentioned Warehouse 42 to anyone, not even to Lacey. The place was a beat-up old facility on a neglected scrap of land. There was no earthly reason for a venture capitalist to be cruising that particular rundown stretch of road, let alone pulling property records to connect it back to me. "Is that so?" I said, holding a perfectly blank, mildly puzzled expression. "Just an old holding property. Nothing in there but dust and rusted pipe. Why do you ask?" Colt smiled. It was a smooth, well-rehearsed smile that never touched his eyes. "Just curious. Seems like prime real estate once you clear the junk out massive footprint. Holding on to dead weight like that is bad business, Gerald. Taxes, liabilities. Have you considered unloading it? I have developers who'd pay top dollar for the land alone." I glanced at my daughter. Lacey was blissfully adrift in her own happiness, sipping her champagne, smiling at her husband. She took him at face value, the prosperous investor he painted himself to be. But my gut, the instinct ground sharp by decades of navigating scrap thieves, crooked contractors, and grasping businessmen, told me something different entirely. Why would a man who supposedly moves tens of millions in venture capital give a damn about an abandoned warehouse in the Rust Belt? Why was he rooting through my private holdings? And why underneath those expensive suits did his eyes carry that hollow, starving look? I lifted my napkin and dabbed my mouth. I let a slow, easy grandfather smile settle across my face, the kind that makes a predator believe his prey is completely unaware. "Well, Colt," I said, keeping my voice light, a little worn at the edges. "I'm just a retired old man. Developer portfolios and real estate markets are a little above my pay grade these days. I let it sit. It isn't bothering anyone." I caught a brief, sharp glimmer of satisfaction cross Colt's face. He had me pegged as weak, as ignorant. He figured he'd stumbled onto a gold mine watched over by a senile old fool. But sitting there in that restaurant trading fake smiles across the table, I already knew one thing, without any doubt. My daughter had married a fraud. I didn't yet know what his specific angle was or how far the deception ran. But I was going to find out. I was going to dismantle his whole carefully constructed front piece by piece until the truth lay bare where Lacey could see it. I settled the bill that evening without a flicker of hesitation. When the waiter brought the check, Colt didn't even put on the usual show of reaching for his wallet. He just leaned back, patted his stomach, and offered a compliment about the quality of the dry-aged ribeye. I handed over my card with an easy smile, playing the generous, contented father-in-law to perfection. But below the table, my hands were balled into fists, knuckles scarred from decades of tearing apart jagged steel, throbbing with a familiar dull ache. The drive home was quiet. The rain had cleared, leaving Cleveland streets slick and gleaming beneath the amber wash of the streetlights. Rolling through the city in my old, reliable truck, my thoughts drifted back to the early years. It's almost funny the way men like Colt look at me. They clock an old man in a canvas work shirt and assume his life has been as uncomplicated as his clothes. They have no conception of what it costs to build a salvage empire out of nothing. When Lorene and I first got married, all we had was a rusted pickup and a mountain of debt. I put in 14-hour days out in the salvage yards. The smell of burning copper diesel fumes and wet earth worked its way so deep into me, it became part of who I was. I tore through condemned factories, stripped copper wiring out of shuttered mills, and hauled scrap iron until my spine felt ready to give. Every bit of it was for them. Lorene would show up at the yard around 7 in the evening, with a thermos of hot soup and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. We'd sit together on the tailgate of that old truck, filthy from head to toe, talking about the future we were raising for Lacey. I made Lorene a promise at her deathbed that I would never let anyone strip away what we had built for our girl. I meant to honor it. Men like Colt Riker can't stand dirt. The smell of sweat and grease makes them recoil. Yet they're always the first to materialize, manicured hands stretched out desperate to claim the money that the dirt produced. He thought I was just a foolish old man sitting on useless industrial lots. He didn't understand that in my trade, you develop a very sharp eye for worthless scrap, dressed up to look valuable. I barely slept that night. I sat in my study, the one room in the house that still carries a faint trace of those old salvage days, staring at the dark oak walls. Why had he homed in on that particular warehouse? The holding company behind it was buried under multiple layers of legal protection. Someone would have to be actively hunting through my affairs to trace that property back to my name. The answer arrived at my front door the very next morning at exactly 9:00. I was in the kitchen putting on a pot of strong black coffee when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Colt on the porch, sharp-tailored navy suit, expensive leather briefcase in hand. Lacey stood right next to him, her arm looped through his, looking up at him with the kind of unquestioning admiration that made my stomach drop. "Good morning, Gerald," Colt said, firing off that same bright, hollow smile from the restaurant. "Hope we aren't cutting into your morning routine." I dried my hands on a dish towel and waved them inside. "Not at all," I said, my voice easy and warm. "Just getting the coffee going. What brings you both out this early on a Saturday?" Lacey leaned in and kissed my cheek. "Colt was up half the night working. Dad," she said, her tone swelling with pride. "He wanted to show you something important." I brought them through to the living room and gestured to the seats. Colt unzipped his briefcase with practiced efficiency. He drew out a thick, glossy financial portfolio tucked inside a professional folder and pushed it across the coffee table in my direction. It looked like the kind of presentation you'd lay before a board of directors, not your retired father-in-law on a Saturday morning. "Gerald, I know we briefly touched on this last night." Colt began leaning forward and planting his elbows on his knees in that rehearsed show of sincerity. "But I haven't been able to stop thinking about your portfolio. I did some deep diving into the county property records. I hope you don't mind. I just want to look out for the family." I picked up the folder. The opening page showed an aerial photograph of the industrial district with my property traced in bright red ink. Beside it sat a breakdown of estimated property taxes and maintenance liabilities. "You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Gerald." Colt went on, his voice sliding into a tone of manufactured concern. "That warehouse is sitting on prime commercial land, but the structure itself is a liability. You're paying commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it genuinely pains me to see capital tied up that way. You are 70 years old. You should be living your retirement in peace, not carrying the tax burden of rusted metal." I leafed through the pages at a leisurely pace, performing the role of a man bewildered by numbers and pie charts. He had put in the work, I'd give him that. But every figure he had was pulled from public tax filings. He hadn't the faintest clue what was actually happening behind those rusted doors. "I have developers in my network right now." Colt said, his gaze locking onto mine with something close to predatory intensity. "They're hunting for industrial footprints in that exact zip code. I can broker a private sale, get that dead weight off your hands before the end of the month, and land a massive cash injection straight into your retirement account. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. I'll manage all the paperwork." I glanced over at Lacey. She squeezed his hand and gave an eager nod. "Dad, you have to admit he's making total sense," she said softly. "You've worked hard your entire life. You don't need the stress of managing abandoned properties. Colt is a financial genius. He knows exactly how to handle these kinds of corporate sales. Let him help you." The fury surged through me again, hot and sharp. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my own living room, actively helping a parasite pick at my assets. He had worked on her thoroughly, convinced her he was our financial savior, a successful expert doing us a great favor by sharing his brilliant business wisdom. I wanted to grab him by the lapels of that tailored suit and drag him out to the curb. I wanted to ask him point blank just how much debt he was concealing beneath those expensive clothes. Instead, I let my shoulders sag. I exhaled slowly, playing the weary, slightly muddled old man he was counting on me to be. "Well, Colt," I said, tapping a calloused finger against his glossy report, "this is an awful lot to take in. I'm not used to moving at this kind of pace. My accountant usually handles all the tax paperwork, and I'm not terribly sharp on this modern financial jargon." Colt's smile broadened a flash of unmistakable triumph behind it. "You don't have to understand the jargon, Gerald. That's precisely what I'm here for. I can draw up limited power of attorney documents this afternoon. Just a narrow proxy so I can negotiate with the buyers on your behalf." I shook my head slowly and handed the folder back to him. "I appreciate the effort, son. Truly. But I'm old-fashioned about these things. I never put my name on anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal here. I'll go through it carefully this week, magnifying glass cup of tea the whole thing. We can sit down and talk it over again next weekend." Colt's smile slipped for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened. That flash of impatience was brief, but I didn't miss it. He needed the money quickly. The urgency coming off him was unmistakable. "Of course, Gerald," he said, recovering smoothly and gathering up his documents. "Take all the time you need. Just keep in mind that real estate markets shift. These buyers won't hold their position indefinitely." As I walked them to the door, I noticed Colt pause at the entrance to my private study. His eyes cut through the open doorway and settled directly on the heavy vintage steel safe bolted into the far corner of the room. He held the look for no more than 2 seconds, but 2 seconds was all I needed. He wasn't planning to wait around for me to sign his papers. He was already mapping out another way in. The hunt had officially started, and I was more than ready. The morning light crawled across the hardwood floors of my study, catching the face of that old steel safe and throwing it into sharp relief. I had been settled in my leather armchair since before sunrise, eyes fixed on the combination dial, turning over the hungry look Colt had worn the night before. Men like him cannot keep their greed from showing. I took a slow pull of my strong black coffee. The house sat in the deep quiet that Lorene and I used to treasure on Sunday mornings. I was on the verge of stepping out to the garden to clear my head when the front doorbell split the silence. I checked the grandfather clock in the hallway. Not yet 8. Nobody turns up unannounced at that hour unless it's an emergency or they want something badly. I cinched my robe and made my way to the foyer. Through the peephole, I could make out my daughter Lacey and her husband on the porch. Colt looked like he'd been lifted straight from the pages of a financial magazine, crisp tailored suit despite it being a Sunday morning. He had a thick leather-bound portfolio clutched tight against his chest. Lacey looked worn out, holding a cardboard tray of coffees and managing a strained smile. I unlatched the door and swung it open, arranging an expression of pleasant surprise. "Lacey, sweetheart, what a lovely surprise." I stepped back to let them through. "You should have called. I'd have put something together for breakfast." "We brought pastries, Dad," Lacey said, brushing my cheek with a kiss as she moved past me toward the kitchen. "We know it's early, but Colt was up practically all night working on something for you. He was so excited he couldn't even hold it until Monday." I turned to Colt. He stood in my foyer, exuding a performance of warm, energetic enthusiasm. "Good morning, Gerald," he said, thrusting out his hand. "I apologize for showing up like this, but when an opportunity presents itself, you have to move." I shook his soft, manicured hand, the contrast with my own scarred palms impossible to ignore. I showed him through to the living room and waved him toward the sofa. Colt sat down and set his leather portfolio on the coffee table with a weighty thud. He unzipped it with practiced ease, drawing out a stack of high-gloss, professionally bound documents and spreading them across the glass surface. I settled into the chair opposite him, hands resting on my knees, embodying the part of the puzzled, aging father-in-law. "Gerald, I know we touched on this briefly at dinner last night." Colt began pitching forward again in that practiced show of earnestness. "But I haven't been able to let go of the question of your holding properties. I took a deep dive into the county tax records. I hope that's all right. I just want to make sure we're protecting the family's future." I lifted the first folder. The cover page displayed an aerial photograph of the industrial district with Warehouse 42 circled in bright red ink. Beside it was a detailed breakdown of estimated property taxes, maintenance liabilities, and projected losses. "You are bleeding money on a dead asset. Gerald," Colt continued, his voice dipping into that same register of practiced artificial concern. That warehouse occupies prime commercial land, but the structure itself is a significant liability. You are paying high commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it physically hurts me to watch capital locked up like this. You are 70 years old. You should be out traveling, relaxing, not carrying taxes on rusted metal and contaminated soil. I paged through, slowly keeping up the performance of a man overwhelmed by the charts and figures. He had done his research, no question, but every number came from public records. He had absolutely no idea what was actually going on behind those rusted doors. I have developers in my private network right now, Colt said, eyes fastening onto mine with that near-predatory intensity. They are specifically hunting for industrial footprints in that zip code. I can broker a private sale, get that dead weight cleared off your books by the end of the month, and put a massive liquid cash injection straight into your retirement account. You wouldn't have to lift a single finger. I'll handle all the paperwork, the lawyers, the negotiations, every last piece of it. Lacey came through from the kitchen, setting down a tray with the coffees and pastries. She settled in next to Colt, looped her arm through his, and fixed me with a look that turned my stomach. Dad, you have to admit he is making total sense. Her voice was soft, but carried an unmistakable edge. You have worked so hard your entire life. You do not need the stress of managing abandoned properties. You are not a young man anymore. Colt is a financial genius. He knows exactly how to handle these corporate sales. Let him help you. The patronizing sting of those words landed hard. She was looking at me the way you look at a stubborn old pack rat clinging to junk. You need to let go of the past, Dad. She went on, her tone sliding further into condescension. Those salvage yards, those dirty old warehouses, they belong to another lifetime. You promised Mom you would take care of yourself. Let Colt handle this. It is what he does best. The anger flared inside me again, bright and fierce. My own daughter, sweet, trusting Lacey, was sitting right there in my living room, helping a parasite dismantle what I'd built. He had gotten deep into her head. He'd sold her the story of himself as our family's financial guardian, a successful man generously sharing his expertise. Part of me wanted to seize him by the collar of that tailored suit and put him out on the street. Demand to know exactly how much debt he was running behind those expensive clothes. Instead, I made my shoulders drop. I let out a slow, weary exhale embodying the worn-out, foggy old man he was banking on. Well, Colt, this is an awful lot to digest at once, I said, pressing a finger against his glossy report. I'm just not accustomed to moving at this pace. My accountant handles all the tax paperwork, and I don't have much of a head for this modern financial language. A look of clear triumph spread across Colt's face. You don't have to understand the language, Gerald. That is precisely why I'm here. I can have the limited proxy documents ready this afternoon, just a signature, so I can negotiate directly with the buyers on your behalf. I shook my head and gathered the folders together. I appreciate the work you've put into this, son. I do. But I make it a rule never to sign anything the same day I've read it. Leave the proposal here. I'll work through it. Colt's jaw tightened a fraction, though the practiced smile never left his face. Of course, Gerald. Take all the time you need. Just remember, these buyers will not wait around forever. The market does not stand still. I understand. I stood at the front window and tracked them as Colt guided Lacey down the porch steps, one hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture that would have looked like tender devotion to anybody else. To me, it looked exactly like a handler steering his mark. They got into his leased luxury sedan, a vehicle I had begun to suspect he couldn't genuinely afford, and backed out of the drive. The engine noise faded down the quiet suburban street and left me alone with the thick, pressing silence of an empty house. I stayed where I was for a long moment, letting a cold, bitter wave of contempt move through me. It wasn't only the arrogance of his little financial presentation or the polished, calculated way he'd tried to coax me into signing away a property I had bled to acquire. It was the sheer nerve of walking into my home, eating the pastries my daughter had purchased, and regarding me as nothing more than a decaying obstacle between him and a payday. The way he looked at me was the way a vulture eyes something that hasn't quite finished dying. I walked back to the living room and picked the glossy portfolio off the coffee table. I dropped it in the trash without a second look. I didn't need his fabricated numbers to tell me anything. I already knew precisely what he was angling for. I moved down the hall to my private study, the very room Colt had been eyeing on his way out. I shut the door behind me and crossed to the vintage steel safe anchored into the corner of the floor. It was a massive solid piece of iron built back in the 1950s. The combination dial was worn smooth from years of handling. I passed my calloused hand across the cold metal surface and felt the solid, familiar reassurance of it. That safe was a monument to everything Lorene and I had put together. When we first started the salvage business, we had no proper banking arrangement to speak of. Our early earnings lived in cash shut inside a small metal lockbox under the bed. As the operation expanded, so did the exposure. I bought this safe after landing our first major contract, a demolition job that ran 6 months from start to finish. The day we bolted it to the floor, I made Lorene a promise that I would always keep it stocked with enough security to ensure Lacey would never have to scrape the way we once had. Lorene was a sharp, perceptive woman. She could read a liar at 20 paces. Had she still been here, she would have seen straight through Colt's expensive suits and hollow charm the very first evening Lacey brought him home for dinner. But Lorene was gone, and the duty to protect our daughter rested entirely on me. I looked at Lorene's framed photograph on the desk. Those warm, knowing eyes looked back through the glass, as though they could see right into me. "I won't let him break her, Lorene," I murmured into the quiet room. "I won't let him touch a single thing we built." But I had to be careful about how I moved. If I went straight to Lacey and told her that her husband was a calculating gold digger, she would defend him without question. Colt had spent 2 years carefully constructing his image as the devoted, successful partner. If I came at him head-on, I'd be cast as the villain, the overbearing, suspicious father trying to wreck her marriage. He would turn my accusations into a wedge between us, pushing Lacey further into isolation and making her more reliant on him than ever. I couldn't let that happen. I had to let Colt believe he was winning. Let him go on thinking his manipulation was taking hold, that the naive old man was slowly swallowing the bait. I needed to feed his greed until impatience made him careless enough to show himself for what he was, with Lacey watching. I picked up my phone and dialed Ramon Estrada. 2 rings, then his gruff voice came through. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. Do we have a problem at the yard today?" "Not at the yard, Ramon," I said, dropping into my leather desk chair. "I need something done, and I need it handled quietly. I want you to pull the original leasing deeds for Warehouse 42. Make clean copies of the cover pages, the ones showing my name as sole proprietor, and the tax assessment values, but redact the leasing agreement with the Federal Transport Company. I don't want any trace of the armored vehicles or the security protocols. It needs to read like a standard inactive holding." Ramon held his silence for a moment. He was a methodical man, a former military logistics officer, who didn't ask unnecessary questions unless something felt off. "Are we preparing for a sale, sir?" "No," I said, my voice going flat. "We are laying a trap. I have a rat working around the edges of my property, and I need to set out some bait. Put the redacted copies in a plain manila folder and have one of the trusted drivers bring it to the house this afternoon." "Understood, sir. It will be there by 3 Celero." I hung up and sat back, eyes fixed on that heavy steel safe. Colt wanted access to my holdings. He wanted to examine the deeds. Fine. I was going to hand him exactly what he was looking for, but on my terms. I'd bring him back next week under the pretext of reviewing his proposal. I'd pass him the redacted paperwork and let him think he was a step closer to getting my signature. I'd play the cautious but warming father-in-law, asking guileless questions about venture capital and property markets. But I knew men like Colt. When desperation gets its hooks into someone, they lose the stomach for slow, careful work. The way he'd lingered over my safe told me everything. He was gauging my home's security, wondering what else I had locked away inside. A man willing to manipulate his own wife to steal a warehouse wouldn't hesitate to break into a private study for leverage or cash. I got up and went to the window, looking out over the neatly kept lawn. The neighborhood lay quiet in the Sunday morning, calm families going about their peaceful routines, completely unaware that a very deliberate war was taking shape inside the walls of my house. I needed to prepare the battlefield. I spent the next 2 hours locking down the study. I went online and ordered 3 high-definition, motion-activated hidden cameras, choosing models built to pass as everyday objects: a digital clock, a smoke detector, and a charging brick. I paid for expedited delivery to make sure they had arrived by Tuesday. I planned to position them so that every angle of the room was covered with a direct line of sight, trained squarely on the vintage safe. Then I turned my attention to the safe itself. It held important documents, family heirlooms, and a substantial amount of emergency cash assets I couldn't leave exposed. I emptied everything into a heavy duffel bag with the intention of moving it all to a secure bank vault first thing Monday morning. In its place, I left only a few bundles of single-dollar bills dressed up with $100 bills. On the outside, a decoy trick I'd picked up years ago, working the rougher end of the industrial yards. I also slipped a very particular fabricated document inside. It was a counterfeit inventory sheet, printed on what looked like official company letterhead. The document described a fictional stockpile of unregistered industrial platinum currently being held at Warehouse 42, with an estimated value of $15 million and a note about an impending quiet liquidation sale. Perfect bait crafted to reach straight into the chest of a desperate man chasing a massive, untraceable score. If Colt managed to crack that safe, he wouldn't find my life savings. He'd find a one-way road to a federal prison cell. He'd find the very thing that would close the trap around him. I swung the heavy steel door shut and spun the dial, feeling the tumblers fall into place. The metallic click rang out in the silent room, a clean final sound. The board was set. The pieces were moving. Colt believed he was the architect of this game, the sharp venture capitalist running circles around an outdated relic. He was about to discover that you don't walk into a scrapyard unless you're ready for the machinery to catch you. I locked the study door behind me and went back to the kitchen. I poured myself a fresh cup of strong black coffee and stepped out onto the back patio. The morning air was cool and sharp. I drew a slow breath and felt the tightness begin to bleed out of my shoulders. I had made Lorene a promise, and I was going to honor it. I was going to shield our daughter, and I was going to bring down the man who had tried to use her as a tool against me. The hunt was underway, and I was holding every key. I let 2 full weeks go by without giving Colt so much as a word. I ignored his carefully casual text messages, sidestepped his phone calls, and kept the flawless impression of an old man moving at his own unhurried pace. I needed him to marinate in his own anxiety. I needed the pressure on his end to keep building until it fractured that polished surface of his. That fracture finally showed itself on a crisp Tuesday morning right outside my daughter's flower shop. Lacey owned a lovely little boutique in the historic district. She had poured her heart, her soul, and every dollar of her savings into that place. It always smelled of fresh lavender, damp potting soil, and blooming tulips. I decided to drop in without warning, bringing her favorite blueberry muffins from the bakery down the street. I left the truck a block away and walked toward the storefront, enjoying the cool morning air. But as I came around the corner, the charm of her little boutique was shattered by the harsh, grinding roar of heavy diesel machinery. A massive battered tow truck was backed hard into the loading zone behind Lacey's shop. The hydraulic lift was already engaged whining as it hoisted the front wheels of Lacey's custom-painted floral delivery van clear off the pavement. I broke into a faster stride, my heart kicking hard. Through the wide glass windows of the shop, I spotted Lacey out on the sidewalk, her cardigan pulled tight across her chest, her shoulders shaking. She was crying. A heavy-set man in a high-visibility vest stood beside the tow truck holding a clipboard, completely unmoved by her tears. I pushed forward, dropping the bakery bag onto a nearby cast-iron bench. "Lacey, sweetheart, what is going on here?" I asked, pulling her in under my arm. She tilted her face up toward me, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. "Dad, I don't understand," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "He says he is repossessing the van. He says we have missed 3 consecutive lease payments, but that is impossible. Colt handles all the business accounts. He set up the autopay for the commercial vehicles months ago. There has to be some kind of terrible mistake." I shifted my attention to the man with the clipboard. He wore the tired, impassive look of someone who spent his days showing up on the worst day of people's lives. I stepped toward him, keeping my voice measured but firm. "Excuse me, friend. I think there may be a clerical error here. My daughter owns this business. We can sort this out right now." The repo man didn't even blink. "Look, buddy, I just follow the work orders," he said, tapping his pen against the metal clip. "The leasing company issued the recovery order yesterday afternoon. 3 months delinquent, no reply to the warning letters. The grace period is done. I am here to collect the asset. You want to dispute the numbers? Call the bank." I was already reaching into my breast pocket for my checkbook, fully prepared to write the amount right there on the hood of his truck if it would stop Lacey from crying. But before my hand could even get to my coat buttons, the screech of tires cut through the street. Colt's leased luxury sedan came veering into the loading zone, jumping the curb before lurching to a stop. He threw his door open and came sprinting toward us. He bore no resemblance to the composed, self-assured venture capitalist who had lounged in my living room 2 weeks before. He looked like a man running from something. His normally immaculate hair was matted to his forehead with a sheen of cold sweat. His tie hung loose, his collar was undone, and his eyes were burning with a frantic, cornered energy. "Well, hey, stop right there. Drop that vehicle immediately," Colt barked, waving his arms as he closed in on the repo man. "What the hell do you think you are doing? This is a massive banking error. You are stealing private property." The tow truck driver crossed his arms. "Save the performance, pal. The account is empty. The payments bounced. I am hooking the rear axle and pulling out of here in 2 minutes." Colt yanked a sleek smartphone from his pocket, his hands trembling so badly he nearly sent it clattering onto the concrete. He jabbed at the screen with frantic, jerky motions. "Listen to me very closely," he growled, pacing a tight, agitated circle. "My wealth management firm handles millions of dollars in liquid assets. My private bank flagged the auto draft as a fraudulent transaction because of a security update. It is a protective hold on the commercial account, that is all. I am moving the funds from my personal portfolio right now." He pressed the phone to his ear jaw, locked so tight the muscles jumped. I watched him without moving, keeping the worried father mask firmly in place while something cold and precise worked behind my eyes. I tracked the heavy bead of sweat sliding down the side of his neck. I clocked the erratic trembling in his hands. I noticed the way his expensive leather shoes shuffled and shifted against the pavement, unable to keep still. Lacey stepped forward and reached for his arm. "Colt, what is happening? Why would the bank freeze the A account for 3 months without telling us?" Colt flinched away from her touch just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. The reflex of a cornered animal. "Do not worry about it, Lacey." He snapped his voice, carrying a sharpness he rarely let her hear. "I told you it is a technical glitch. The wire transfers got crossed between the offshore holding and the domestic branch. I am fixing it. Just let me work." He spent the next 10 minutes in a furious back and forth with someone on the phone. He retreated down the alleyway, voice dropped low but frantic, working his free hand in wild, pleading gestures. Finally, he marched back to the repo man and held the phone up to the driver's ear. The driver listened, exhaled heavily, and handed the phone back. "Fine," he said, eyeing Colt with undisguised contempt. "The agency just confirmed a manual wire transfer. You bought yourself 30 days, buddy. But if that wire bounces, I am pulling straight into your driveway next time." With a loud hiss of released pressure, the hydraulic lift eased Lacey's delivery van back down onto the pavement. The truck disengaged its heavy steel hooks and rumbled away down the street, trailing a thick curtain of diesel exhaust behind it. Lacey let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned her weight against the side of her van. "Oh my God," she whispered, pressing her fingers to her temples. "That was terrifying. Colt, are you absolutely sure the business account is fine?" Colt forced out a laugh, dragging a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. He pulled Lacey into a tight embrace and kissed the top of her head. "Everything is perfectly fine, babe, I promise. Just a stupid clerical error at the bank. You know how these massive institutions operate. The algorithms flag a large transfer and suddenly everything freezes. I'll have my assistant tear into our account manager this afternoon." Lacey smiled and settled into his chest, taking every word at face value. But the moment Colt glanced over her shoulder, his eyes locked with mine. For one brief, unguarded instant, the mask came all the way off. What looked back at me was not a wealthy investor. It was pure, undiluted terror. He snapped the arrogant smile back into place and clapped his hands together. "Well, crisis averted," he announced, his voice climbing an octave too high. "Gerald, good to see you. Sorry about the morning chaos, just the ups and downs of high-level corporate banking." "Right," I replied evenly, lifting the bakery box from the bench and passing it to Lacey. High-level corporate banking. I hugged my daughter, kissed her cheek, and told her I'd call her later. I walked back to my truck, unlocked the door, and settled into the driver's seat. I didn't turn the engine over right away. I just sat there, both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, staring at my own face in the rearview mirror. Millionaire venture capitalists don't have their wives' delivery vans dragged off over a technical glitch. Men who manage vast portfolios of liquid assets don't tremble while trying to wire a few $100s to a collections agency. They don't pace like cornered addicts in a back alley. They don't stare at a tow truck driver with sheer leg-buckling terror as though their life hangs in the balance. Colt Riker was not dealing with a banking error. He was drowning. He was suffocating under a mountain of debt, desperately trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship. He had drained Lacey's commercial accounts down to nothing, leaving her fully exposed, completely vulnerable, and blind to the financial ruin closing in around her. What had started as a gut feeling had hardened into solid, undeniable fact. My son-in-law was a desperate, dangerous fraud, and he was actively bleeding my daughter's business dry to keep his own head above water. He needed a massive cash infusion to save himself, which explained exactly why he had suddenly become so eager to liquidate my industrial warehouse. He was hunting for a lifeline, and I was going to hand him an anvil. That Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Lacey on my porch with an overnight bag looking wrung out. Colt stood just behind her, gripping a duffel and wearing a tight, strained smile. They told me a plumbing problem had flooded their master bathroom and soaked the carpets in their townhouse. The property management company, Colt explained, needed the whole weekend to run industrial dehumidifiers. It sounded like a plausible nuisance, but I wasn't buying it. Millionaires don't pack up and retreat to their father-in-law's guest room over a burst pipe. They book a suite downtown and let insurance handle the rest. I smiled, warmly stepped aside, and offered them the guest room. I knew exactly why they'd come. The plumbing story was a fabrication. Colt was running out of time. His creditors were tightening the circle. The repossession agency was on his heels, and he needed unobstructed access to my home. Letting him sleep under my roof felt like welcoming a venomous snake into my bed, but I played the gracious host. I cooked dinner, poured him a glass of scotch, and sat there listening to him brag about phantom investment portfolios. Lacey leaned comfortably against his shoulder, completely blind to the frantic desperation radiating off him. By 10:00, they excused themselves and headed to bed. I waited until I heard the heavy oak door of the guest suite click shut. Then I withdrew to my bedroom and left my door open just a crack. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers in the dark, fully dressed, listening to the quiet sounds of the house I'd lived in for 3 decades. When you spend your life guarding scrapyards full of valuable copper, you become a light sleeper. You learn to tell the difference between the harmless settling of a foundation and the deliberate step of someone who shouldn't be moving. The house held its silence for hours. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight then, 1:00 a.m. The neighborhood was dead to the world. And then, at exactly 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, I heard it, a subtle muffled groan of wood. The 4th floorboard in the upstairs hallway just outside the guest suite has a distinct squeak when you plant your foot squarely on its center. I swung my legs off the edge of the mattress and stood my bare feet silent against the carpet. I left every light off. I moved through the shadows of my own home with the practiced ease of a man who knows every corner of his territory. I descended the stairs with slow, measured breathing. The downstairs hallway was washed in the pale moonlight, filtering through the high windows. I stopped at the foot of the staircase and pressed my back flat against the cool plaster wall. Someone was moving around inside my private study. The heavy door was pushed open just a fraction, a thin blade of pale light cutting through the narrow gap and sliding across the hallway floor. I eased closer and leaned forward to peer through the crack. Colt was inside. He had on dark sweatpants and a black t-shirt, a small pen light clenched between his teeth. He was crouched in front of my heavy fireproof filing cabinet, the one sitting directly beneath the framed photograph of Lorene. He'd passed right over the vintage steel safe in the corner. He must have figured out on his first visit that he didn't have what it took to crack a mechanical combination lock. So, he'd turned his attention to the filing cabinet, working a thin metal tension wrench and a lockpick against the simple cylinder lock that held the drawers shut. I watched him work. His breathing was heavy and ragged, filling the quiet room. His hands were shaking with a frantic, unhinged urgency. He was no professional thief. He was a desperate man backed into a corner, stripped of every moral boundary he might once have had. The lock gave with a soft metallic click. Colt nearly wrenched the bottom drawer off its track. He started tearing through the hanging folders, pitching aside utility bills, property deeds, and old tax returns. He was after something specific. He wanted hard numbers. He wanted to know exactly what I was worth and how fast he could get at it to pay off whoever was breathing down his neck. I let him dig for another full minute, letting the sheer audacity of his betrayal settle over me. He was standing in a house my own sweat had paid for, trying to steal the future I'd built for the woman sleeping upstairs. I stepped into the doorway, raised my hand, and firmly flicked the brass light switch on the wall. Harsh yellow light flooded the study. Colt gasped a sharp, terrified sound and physically recoiled, dropping the pen light onto the carpet and spinning around, eyes wide, chest heaving. He looked like a deer frozen in the path of an oncoming freight train. "Colt," I said, keeping my voice mild, almost drowsy, as if I'd just been pulled from a deep sleep. "What on earth are you doing down here in the dark? Is something wrong with the guest room?" For 3 agonizing seconds, he stared at me, his mind clearly scrambling to land on a believable lie. Then the slick, manipulative con artist took over. He let out a forced, breathless chuckle and ran a hand through his hair, leaning back casually against the filing cabinet to block my view of the open drawer behind him. "Gerald." He exhaled and pressed a hand to his chest in a show of exaggerated relief. "You scared the living daylights out of me. I am so sorry for sneaking around. I woke up with terrible heartburn. That spicy brisket at dinner really did a number on my stomach. I didn't want to wake Lacey, so I came downstairs looking for the kitchen. I must have gotten turned around in the dark and wandered into your office. I was just trying to find a light switch." I offered him a gentle, accommodating smile that concealed the absolute disgust simmering beneath it. "Of course, son," I said, my tone wrapped in counterfeit sympathy. "The kitchen is down the hall to the left. I keep a bottle of antacids in the pantry above the sink. Let me go grab them for you." I turned and headed to the kitchen, leaving him alone for just a moment. When I came back and pressed the chalky tablets into his hand, he thanked me with exaggerated warmth, wished me a good night, and hurried back upstairs. I stood still until his footsteps faded into silence. Then I walked back into the study. He had pushed the cabinet drawer shut, but panic had made him sloppy. I slid the drawer open and looked inside. The folder holding my complete net worth and liquid cash reserves had been pulled halfway out, jutting at an awkward angle from the neatly ordered files around it. He had found precisely what he came for right there in my quiet house. The following morning, I stood at the kitchen counter, idly working through the newspaper. Lacey came downstairs first, still rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and kissed my cheek. Colt followed a few minutes later, looking surprisingly well-rested for a man who had spent the pre-dawn hours picking a lock on a filing cabinet. He greeted me with hollow energy, poured himself some cereal, and made small talk about the weather. I played the gracious host warm smile, asking whether his heartburn had finally settled. He assured me it had completely unaware of what I actually knew. The hidden cameras had been quietly installed the previous afternoon, while Lacey and Colt were out running errands. One was tucked inside a digital clock on the living room mantel, giving a wide, sweeping view of the seating area. I knew how to rig a trap to catch a rat. Colt had taken the bait in the study, but a slightly displaced file folder wasn't enough to bring him down. If I raised it with Lacey, he would spin a dozen convincing lies without breaking a sweat. I needed proof that couldn't be argued away. I needed him caught in the act, captured on high-definition video, with no room left to wriggle free. After breakfast, Lacey mentioned she needed a shower before a meeting. Colt said he planned to sit and read in the living room. It was the opening I had been waiting for. I told them casually that I was stepping out for a walk. As I passed through the living room, I slipped my iPad from my briefcase. I unlocked the screen and disabled the auto lock. Then I opened my email and pulled up a carefully constructed message I had put together the night before. It was designed to look like confidential correspondence from my wealth management bank. The subject line read, "Urgent portfolio liquidation." The body laid out a fictional impending transfer of $7 million into a highly liquid checking account. It was the ultimate prize dangled in front of a drowning man. I set the unlocked iPad gently on the center of the coffee table right beside Colt. I grabbed my walking stick, called out a cheerful goodbye to the empty hallway, and stepped out the front door, pulling it shut with a loud, decisive click. I did not go for a walk. I went 2 blocks down and climbed into my truck. I took out my smartphone and opened the secure app connected to my hidden cameras. The live feed buffered for a moment, then snapped into crystal clear focus. I sat there with slow, even breathing, watching a silent film play out across that small screen inside my living room. For the first 2 minutes, Colt didn't move. He sat on the sofa with a magazine staring at nothing. He was listening. He was making sure Lacey was upstairs and that I was genuinely gone. The sound of the shower running overhead gave him his all clear. He lowered the magazine. His gaze snapped to the coffee table, eyes locking onto the glowing screen of my iPad. He stared at it like a man who had just spotted buried gold. The internal debate lasted only seconds. The intoxicating pull of that fabricated email was more than he could resist. He leaned forward, threw a quick paranoid glance over his shoulder toward the staircase. Seeing nothing, he reached out and snatched the iPad right off the glass table. The camera captured his face with excruciating clarity. The polished mask of the successful venture capitalist dissolved instantly, replaced by the feral, hungry look of a scavenger. His eyes moved rapidly across the screen as he absorbed the fake email. I watched his jaw go slack. He practically buzzed with adrenaline. $7 million in liquid cash ready to move. It was the exact lifeline he had been frantically hunting for. Colt didn't just read the email. He immediately yanked his own smartphone from his pocket. His hands were trembling so badly he had to brace his elbows on his knees to hold the lens steady. He began photographing the iPad screen, the fake account numbers, the routing details, the contact information for the fictional bank manager. The dam had burst, and his greed had the wheel. I watched in cold disgust as he closed the email and began tearing through my private device. He opened banking apps, investment portfolios, personal text threads. He was hunting for passwords, security questions, anything he could exploit to drain me dry. He photographed every screen. He moved with a frantic, unhinged speed, thumbs flying across the glass. This was no misunderstanding. It wasn't a banking error, and it was certainly not the behavior of a concerned son-in-law trying to protect his family. Every plausible cover story was stone dead. I was watching a calculated predatory invasion. I was watching a thief mapping out the systematic destruction of everything I had spent a lifetime building. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until the leather groaned. A deep, hollow sorrow moved through me when I thought of Lacey upstairs, washing her hair, completely unaware that the man she loved was working to rob her father blind. Colt believed he had hit the ultimate jackpot. He thought he had stumbled onto the key that would wipe out his catastrophic financial failures. He had no idea that every frantic swipe was being recorded and stored on a secure cloud server, constructing an airtight wall of evidence against him. After 5 minutes of frantic digital pillaging, the shower upstairs must have gone silent. Colt froze. His head jerked up. He hastily closed every app on the iPad and returned it to the exact screen and position where I had left it. He dropped his phone into his pocket, lifted his magazine, and settled back against the sofa cushions with his legs crossed, a portrait of effortless leisure. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, let his eyes sweep the staircase one final time to confirm he was safe. Then, one slow breath, a smooth of the hair, a tug at his collar, and he was the perfect devoted husband again. I closed the app and let the screen go dark. The silence inside the truck was absolute. I sat with it for a few moments, letting the cold reality sink all the way to the bone. The hunt was finished. The trap had closed, and the rat was caught. I would not let him strip away what Lorene and I had spent our lives building. This was my domain, and today he had made a fatal miscalculation. I now had exactly the leverage required to dismantle Colt Riker completely and sever his parasitic grip on my daughter. I drew a long, steady breath, pushed open the heavy door, and walked back toward my house. The deception was over, and the time for patience had run out. I was ready to tear down his illusion and show Lacey the truth. The morning after, I watched my son-in-law attempt to steal my digital identity. I told Lacey and Colt I was making a run to the store. Instead, I pointed my truck toward a worn-down diner on the edge of town. I took a corner booth. 10 minutes later, Clifton pulled into the lot. He was a private investigator I had hired years ago. A quiet man with a rare gift for uncovering the things people bury deepest. He slid into the seat across from me and set a thick manila folder on the scratched Formica table. He skipped the pleasantries entirely. He ordered a black coffee and fixed me with a pair of grim, weary eyes. "You were right to trust your gut on this one," Gerald Clifton said. "I dug into Colt Riker and his wealth management firm. The whole operation is a facade, smoke mirrors, and nothing behind them." I kept both hands flat on the table. "Tell me exactly what we're dealing with." Clifton opened the folder. He pushed a grainy photograph of a strip mall across the table toward me. "Riker Venture Capital doesn't exist. It's a rented post office box inside a shipping center. There's no corporate office. There's no board of directors. There's no massive portfolio of liquid assets. He's registered as a sole proprietor, but he hasn't filed a legitimate corporate tax return in over 3 years. I felt my jaw tighten. How is he covering the tailored suits and the least luxury sedans? How did he manage to fool Lacey? Clifton slid another sheet across the table. 2 years ago, Colt actually had some money. He came into a decent inheritance from his late grandfather. He put every single penny of it into a massive cryptocurrency scheme. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with what's coming. What I was about to discover would change the way I saw everything and everyone under my roof. Here's something I want you to think about. If you suspected someone close to you was working against you in secret, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and let the truth reveal itself on its own terms? He believed he was going to become a billionaire overnight. Instead, the platform collapsed. He lost his entire inheritance inside 48 hours. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. He lost everything. Worse than everything, Clifton corrected, leaning forward. When the inheritance was gone, he tried to chase his losses. He started borrowing money to buy back into the market, hoping for a miraculous recovery. When the legitimate banks cut him off, he turned to shadow lenders. He currently owes just over $2 million to a very dangerous loan shark syndicate operating out of Detroit. I stared at the red numbers. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. The desperate pacing in that alleyway. The raw terror on his face when the tow truck driver threatened to come back. The frantic attempt to break into my filing cabinet, and the look on his face when he spotted the fake email detailing a $7 million transfer. Colt Riker was a dead man walking. The people he owed money to didn't send strongly worded letters. They sent men who broke legs and burned houses to the ground. "There's more, Gerald," Clifton said quietly. "And this next part is going to make you want to reach across this table." Clifton drew a final stack of papers from the folder. They were detailed transaction logs. I recognized the account name immediately. It belonged to Lacey's Floral Boutique. "I pulled the financial records for your daughter's shop." Clifton explained, his tone weighted with sympathy. "When they got married, Colt convinced Lacey to let him handle all the accounting. He told her it would take the burden off her shoulders, but he hasn't been managing her accounts. He's been systematically gutting them." I lifted the papers, my hands not entirely steady. Every week for the past 8 months, Colt had been siphoning thousands of dollars out of Lacey's business account. He was routing the money through a web of shell companies, frantically trying to scrape together enough to cover the minimum monthly interest payments on his $2 million syndicate debt. "He stopped paying her commercial leases 3 months ago," Clifton went on. "That's why her delivery van got repossessed. He stopped paying her wholesale flower suppliers. He stopped covering the boutique's utility bills. Her business is completely insolvent. Gerald, she's running on fumes. Before the end of this month, the bank will freeze her accounts and she'll be forced into bankruptcy." The air drained out of my lungs like I'd been punched. Lacey had built that boutique from nothing. She had spent countless late nights hunched over her kitchen table, sketching out floral arrangements and nurturing a clientele one customer at a time. It was her dream, her greatest source of pride, and her husband was bleeding it dry behind her back to save his own miserable skin. He was destroying her. "He's using her as a human shield," I said, my voice coming out rough. "He is drowning Gerald," Clifton said, pushing the folder toward me. "And when a man like Colt starts to go under, he will drag down whoever is closest to him just to steal another breath of air. He targeted you because you are his last resort. He looked at your properties and decided he could work you into signing over an asset. He needs a massive payout right now. If he doesn't get it, those loan sharks will come." I reached out and laid my hand on top of the manila folder. A sudden profound calm settled over me. It was the same cold, focused clarity I used to feel, standing in the scrapyard, preparing to break down a massive and dangerous piece of machinery. No room for error, no room for hesitation. Every move had to be precise, deliberate, and devastating. Colt had crossed a line that could never be walked back. He had manipulated my daughter's heart. He had stolen her hard-earned money. He had dragged the shadow of violent, dangerous criminals to our very doorstep. He had looked me in the eye and smiled while quietly engineering the destruction of my family. "Thank you, Clifton," I said, sliding the folder into my briefcase. "You did exceptional work." "What are you going to do, Gerald?" Clifton asked, studying my face carefully. "If you need me to reach out to the authorities, I have connections in the Financial Crimes Division. We can have him arrested for fraud before the week is out." I shook my head slowly and finished my coffee. "No! The authorities would put him in a cell, and that was too easy. That was an escape. If he goes to prison now, Lacey will think it's all a mistake. She'll tell herself he was just a businessman who got in over his head. She'll visit him. She'll feel sorry for him. I need her to see exactly who he is. I need her to see the thing hiding behind that tailored suit. I eased out of the booth and stood gripping the handle of my briefcase. I walked out of the diner and back to my old truck. I set the folder on the empty passenger seat beside the iPad, holding the footage of Colt trying to rob me blind. The hunt was officially over. It was finally time for the execution. I pulled out of the lot and merged onto the interstate, pointed straight toward the downtown business district. The drive took less than 20 minutes, but my mind tore through 1,000 different scenarios. The manila folder and the silver iPad rode on the passenger seat like unexploded ordnance. I parked in the underground garage of a sleek glass high-rise and rode the private elevator up to the 14th floor. Alistair Dunphy had been my corporate attorney and trusted confidant for over 25 years. He was the man who had navigated the complex legal terrain when Lorene and I first grew our salvage operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Alistair was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who believed in the absolute authority of an ironclad contract. His secretary showed me straight into his spacious corner office. Alistair rose from behind his large oak desk with a warm smile that creased the corners of his eyes, but his expression sobered the instant he registered my face. He knew me too well. He could tell the difference between a social visit and a man who was preparing for war. "Sit down, Gerald," Alistair said, motioning to the heavy leather chairs across from his desk. "You look like you're about to tear a building apart with your bare hands. What's going on?" I didn't waste a breath on pleasantries. I opened my briefcase, drew out the thick manila folder Clifton had handed me, and set it squarely on his clean desk. Then I placed the iPad right beside it, pulling up the hidden camera footage from my living room. "I need you to go through these financial logs, Alistair. And then I want you to watch this video." I said, my voice unnervingly level. "Take all the time you need. I'll be right here." Alistair frowned and picked up the folder. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and started to read. For the first few minutes, the only sound in the room was the steady tick of his antique wall clock and the crisp rustle of turning pages. I watched his professional composure begin to fracture jaw, tightening eyes, narrowing in disbelief. When he reached the transaction logs detailing the systematic draining of Lacey's business account, he exhaled a low, harsh breath. He set the papers down and pressed play on the iPad. He watched the high-definition footage of my son-in-law frantically photographing fabricated banking details, swiping through my personal data like a desperate, starving scavenger. When the video ended, Alistair pushed the tablet away as though it were contaminated. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose, fixing me with an expression of profound, chilling gravity. Gerald, this is absolutely catastrophic," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "This man is not merely a fraud. He is actively committing grand larceny against your daughter. He is attempting to breach your secure financial accounts. And if what these investigative reports say about his $2 million debt to the Detroit syndicate is true, he is drawing incredibly dangerous violent criminals directly into your family's world. We cannot afford to sit on this for a single day." Alistair reached for his desk phone fingers, hovering over the keypad. "I'm calling the Financial Crimes Division right now. I have a contact at the Federal Bureau who handles syndicate-related extortion and fraud. We hand over this folder, we hand over the video, and they will have Colt in handcuffs before dinner. We can freeze his assets, secure Lacey's remaining business capital, and have a protective order in place by tomorrow morning." "Put the phone down, Alistair," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade. Alistair froze, staring at me with pure, unguarded disbelief. "Gerald, did you not hear a word I just said? The man owes $2 million to literal loan sharks. He is bleeding Lacey completely dry. If he figures out that the bank transfer he photographed on your tablet is a fake, he will panic. Desperate men do desperate, violent things. We have to bring the police in on this right now." I leaned forward, forearms on his desk, holding his gaze. "If we call the police right now, we throw away everything." I said, weighing every syllable so he'd understand what was actually at stake. Alistair looked thoroughly exasperated. "How do you figure that you have the evidence? You have him dead to rights." "I have legal evidence," I replied, keeping a firm grip on my emotions. "I do not have emotional evidence. You're a lawyer, Alistair. You see this whole situation through the rigid lens of a courtroom. I'm seeing it through the eyes of a father. You know my daughter. You know how fiercely loyal she is. Colt has spent 2 solid years grooming her, cutting her off from her own instincts, and building himself up in her mind as the perfect devoted husband. He has completely reshaped her reality. I paused, letting the weight of that settle into the room. If the police knock down their door tonight and haul him away in handcuffs, what do you honestly think happens next? He is a gifted liar. He will have a story together before they even finish reading him his rights. He'll tell Lacey that I set him up because I never approved of him. He'll say the iPad incident was just him trying to help manage my accounts and that the missing money from her shop was a temporary investment strategy that went sideways. He will cast himself as the victim. He will cry, he will beg, and he will persuade her that her paranoid, overbearing father manufactured the whole thing to destroy their marriage. Alistair slowly drew his hand back from the phone receiver. He settled into his heavy leather chair, his expression shifting as the psychological reality of it fully landed. She would defend him, Alistair murmured, shaking his head slowly. She would defend him to her last breath. I confirmed, a dull ache pressing against my chest. She would take whatever money she has left and pour it into his defense. She would turn her back on me, and he would use that blind loyalty to drag the whole thing through the courts for years. He would drain her completely dry while fighting the charges, and I'd lose my daughter forever. I cannot settle for a partial victory. I made a promise to Lorene that I would protect our girl, and throwing Colt in a cell while he still owns her heart is not protection. That is a catastrophe. "So what's your move, Gerald?" Alistair asked, threading his fingers together over the desk. "I am going to build a trap he cannot escape," I said, my tone dropping into something harder. "I am going to hand him the rope, and I am going to build the gallows right inside my own living room. Lacey has to see his true nature for herself. She needs to watch the mask come all the way off with no room left to spin a story and no room for her to make excuses for him." I left Alistair Dunphy sitting quietly behind his large oak desk, still staring at the frozen iPad screen like a man regarding a coiled and venomous snake. The drive to the industrial zone felt like crossing into a different world, entirely thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and burning copper. This was the empire built on rust and hard labor that Colt Riker thought he could take from me. I pulled my truck through the heavy chain-link gates of the main salvage yard. The hydraulic crushers were deafening. I parked near our corrugated steel hub and headed for the loading dock. Ramon Estrada was already waiting for me. Ramon had been my warehouse manager for 22 years. He ran the operation with military discipline. He asked no questions as I led him into the dusty back office. "Close the door, Ramon," I said, dropping my briefcase onto the battered metal desk. "And kill the main radio. I need complete quiet for this." Ramon clicked the deadbolt into place. "Whatever you need, Mr. Whitaker, we are ready." I dropped into the creaky office chair and pulled out a stack of blank official company letterhead. The paper was thick and watermarked with the original logo Lorene had proudly designed 30 years ago. "I need us to build a lie, Ramon," I said. "I need an inventory manifest that looks so classified, so undeniably valuable, that a desperate man would risk federal prison to get his hands on it." Ramon raised a dark, questioning eyebrow, but gave a slow nod. "What kind of inventory are we talking about?" "Platinum and pure rhodium," I replied. "The most untraceable high-yield salvage materials on the market." I drew a slow, steadying breath. It was finally time to spring the trap. The next 2 grueling hours, Ramon and I worked together to construct the perfect decoy. We built out a detailed logistical manifest. Ramon dictated precise chemical weights and extraction codes to give the document an air of flawless authenticity. We assembled a fabricated paper trail around a massive off-the-books salvage operation involving decommissioned aerospace components and industrial catalytic converters. According to the document, my company had been accumulating these precious metals over an entire decade. The materials were listed as unregistered, sitting completely off the grid. We put the total value at $15 million. "And the storage location?" Ramon asked, pulling a heavy file from the cabinet. "We listed as Warehouse 42. I answered, a cold smile edging at the corners of my mouth. "The exact property he's already been pressuring me to sell. It makes perfect sense. He'll assume I've been sitting on the metals there and refusing to sell the land to keep the illegal stockpile hidden." Ramon ran the final document through the old dot matrix printer in the corner. The faded ink gave the manifest an aged, deeply classified look. I took a red ink stamp from the top drawer and pressed it firmly across the top of the first page. "Highly confidential, eyes only." I slid the documents into a worn manila envelope and tied the string closure in a particular knot I would recognize if anyone tampered with it. "Be very careful with this, boss," Rahman warned, his voice dropping to something low and deadly serious as I moved toward the door. 15 million in unforgettable metal is going to make him very dangerous. A cornered, starving animal will bite. "I know exactly how a cornered animal bites, Rahman," I replied, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun. "That's precisely why I'm leading him straight into a cage." I drove back to the quiet, well-kept suburbs, parked in the driveway, and walked through the front door. The house was still. Lacey had left a note on the kitchen counter, saying she and Colt had gone to the boutique to deal with the tow truck agency and sort out their supposed banking issue. It gave me an ideal window to set the stage. I walked slowly down the long hallway and unlocked the heavy walnut door to my private study. Afternoon light threw long shadows across the floor. I crossed to the fireproof filing cabinet Colt had picked open the night before and pulled the bottom drawer out. I didn't bury the envelope at the very bottom that would make it too hard to find. I needed him to come across it almost immediately, but I needed him to feel like he'd been clever enough to discover it himself. I wedged the thick manila envelope about halfway down between my legitimate tax returns and my original property deeds. I left the red confidential stamp just barely visible, catching the low light inside the drawer, an irresistible beacon for a man hunting for salvation. I didn't want him wrestling with tension wrenches again. I wanted him to slide the drawer open and find his prize with almost no effort at all. Next, I verified the hidden cameras. The tiny lens seated in the smoke detector had a clean, unobstructed line of sight to the filing cabinet. The digital clock on the bookshelf covered the doorway. Every corner of the study was accounted for. I pulled out my phone and confirmed the live feed, crisp, high definition, ready to capture every movement. I walked out of the study and left the door cracked open exactly an inch and a half. A subtle invitation, a psychological lure engineered to whisper directly to his paranoia and his hunger. He would pass that door tonight, see the sliver of darkness, and his compulsion to hunt would pull him inside. I spent what remained of the evening playing the difficult role of the warm, completely unsuspecting father-in-law. When Lacey and Colt returned from the boutique, they both looked hollowed out. Lacey's eyes were red from crying, and Colt performed with theatrical fury about the incompetent banking system holding their funds hostage. I made dinner, offered steady reassurances, and watched him work. He was a spectacular liar, kissing my daughter's forehead, swearing to her that everything would be sorted out by Monday. But beneath the glass table, his right knee bounced with a relentless, uncontrollable tremor. The $2 million syndicate debt was consuming him from the inside. He was running out of time, running out of cover stories, and running out of money. He needed a miracle. At exactly 10:30, they excused themselves and disappeared into the guest suite. I withdrew to my bedroom and left the door open just a sliver. I stretched out on top of the mattress, fully dressed phone resting in my palm. The screen was dark, but the camera application was armed and ready. I didn't have to wait until 2:00 in the morning this time. The desperation was moving faster now. At exactly midnight, the floorboard in the upstairs hallway groaned. Soft footsteps padded down the staircase. I raised my phone, woke the screen, and tapped the live feed icon. The digital clock camera inside the study flickered on. The heavy walnut door pushed open slowly, silently, throwing a long shadow across the carpet. Colt Riker stepped into the room, swallowed the bait whole, and sealed his own fate. The morning after Colt broke into my study, the house carried a weight that nobody named. At breakfast, Colt was practically humming with a manic, poorly masked energy. He drank his coffee too fast, his eyes moving constantly around the room, unable to stay in his seat for more than a moment. He told Lacey they needed to get back to their townhouse, claiming the property management company had finally cleared the plumbing issue. Lacey looked relieved, completely unaware that her husband was actually racing to execute a phantom heist. I helped them carry their bags out to the driveway, playing the role of the bittersweet father, watching his daughter leave. I pulled Lacey into a long hug, resting my chin on top of her head, taking in the scent of her floral perfume. I told her I'd stop by the boutique later in the week. Then I turned to Colt. I shook his hand and wished him well with his venture capital meetings. As I passed him his heavy leather briefcase, my thumb moved across the hidden magnetic lining of the side pocket. Earlier that morning, while he was in the shower, washing off the sweat of his midnight burglary, I had tucked a tiny state-of-the-art listening device deep into the seams of the leather. It was barely the size of a coin, fitted with a long-lasting battery and a cellular transmitter. I watched them back out of the driveway, the taillights of his leased luxury sedan, dissolving into the distance. I didn't go back inside. I walked straight to my old truck, climbed in and locked the doors. I took my phone from my pocket and opened the secure audio application. The interface hummed to life, connecting to the transmitter buried inside Colt's briefcase. For the first 20 minutes, I heard nothing but highway noise and the faint murmur of the radio. Then came the distinct sound of the passenger door opening and closing. He had dropped Lacey off at the flower shop. The moment she was out of the car, the whole audio picture shifted. The radio cut off abruptly. I could hear Colt breathing heavy, ragged, frantic. The sound of a man who was nearly out of air. I heard the aggressive squeal of tires as he accelerated and drove erratically. A few minutes later, the car stopped hard, the transmission grinding into park. I closed my eyes, leaned my head back against the headrest, and listened. Rapid, uneven tapping on a phone keypad. The line rang 3 times before someone picked up. The voice on the other end was low and gravelly, completely stripped of warmth or any pretense of courtesy. It said a single word, his name. Colt exhaled an unsteady breath, his voice pitching upward with raw desperation. "Listen to me," he pleaded, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I know the payment is late, I know we're past the grace period, but you have to hear me out right now. I just found the ultimate score. I have the answer to everything. It's bigger than anything we've ever talked about." The gravelly voice on the other end cut straight through his panic. "We're not interested in more empty promises, Riker. We gave you 2 weeks to liquidate the wife's business assets. You missed the deadline. The boss is out of patience. You owe $2 million. You have 48 hours to deliver the cash, or we're sending a crew to your house to collect what's owed in flesh." "No, you don't understand." Colt snapped, his voice bouncing off the inside of the car. "I'm not talking about the flower shop. That place is completely tapped out. There's nothing left to squeeze from it. I'm talking about $15 million in unregistered, untraceable industrial platinum." The line went dead silent. I could almost feel the shift in the atmosphere through the audio feed, something heavy and dangerous settling in. "Explain," the loan shark said, his tone sharpening into focus. Colt swallowed hard, his breathing uneven against the microphone. "My father-in-law, he's an old scrap metal hoarder, owns a dozen industrial properties scattered around the city. I had him pegged as a clueless old man sitting on worthless real estate. But I got into his private study last night. I found his confidential holding manifests. He's been stockpiling decommissioned aerospace components and catalytic converters off the books for a decade. He's got a massive cache of pure platinum and rhodium, sitting in a secure facility just outside the city limits. Warehouse 42. I saw the official paperwork myself. It's completely off the grid. The government has no idea it exists. Are you telling me this old man is sitting on $15 million in raw metal and you can get to it?" the loan shark asked, a predatory edge sliding into his voice. "I can get you full access." Colt insisted, his words tripping over each other in his rush to save his own skin. "He's old and trusting. He's practically inviting me to manage his assets. Give me 3 days, just 72 hours. I'll get the keys to the warehouse. I'll hand over the exact coordinates, the security codes, the full layout. You send your crew in with transport trucks and you take the entire stockpile. We fence the metal. You take your $2 million and extra million for your trouble, and I keep the rest. A clean, untraceable ghost job." Another long, suffocating pause. I sat in my truck, both hands clamped on the steering wheel. The leather groaned under the pressure of my grip. I was listening to the man who shared a bed with my daughter, actively broker a massive criminal heist against my family. He was selling me out to violent thugs to buy himself a way out. The 3 days. The loan shark finally set his voice cold and flat. "You have 72 hours to deliver warehouse access. If you're lying to us, Riker, if this is another one of your pathetic stall tactics, we won't just break your legs. We'll take your wife. We know where her little boutique is. We know her routine. We'll take her, and we'll make you watch what happens when you cross us." The air in my lungs turned to ground glass. My heart slammed hard against my ribs. I waited for Colt to push back. I waited for him to tell the loan shark to leave Lacey out of it, to show one single trace of human feeling. Colt let out a cold, dismissive laugh. "Do whatever you want with her," he said, his voice completely hollow. "Give me the 3 days. I'll get you the platinum, you take your cut, and I'm catching the first flight to Dubai." I lowered my phone and let the screen go dark as the echo of those words hung in the cab of my truck. He was willing to offer up his own wife. He was perfectly prepared to hand Lacey over to violent, merciless loan sharks, just to buy himself enough time to disappear. A cold, black fury closed around my heart and squeezed until my chest ached. I had already known he was a greedy, manipulative coward, but hearing him throw my daughter's life away like a piece of garbage burned away every last trace of restraint I might have held on to. This was no longer simply about shielding my financial assets or delivering a hard lesson to an arrogant son-in-law. This was about removing a dangerous predator who had embedded himself in the very heart of my family. He had decided his own fate with those words. I felt no pity for him, only a deep, steady resolve to see my plan all the way through to its conclusion. Colt believed he had the upper hand. He was genuinely convinced he had outmaneuvered a dim old scrap metal hoarder. He thought he was pulling off the perfect untraceable heist, one that would wipe out his crushing debts and bankroll a glamorous getaway to Dubai. He'd swallowed the bait without a moment's hesitation, treating the fabricated inventory manifest as unquestionable truth. In his mind, he was already tallying the millions locked inside a hidden cache of gleaming platinum and raw rhodium, all of it waiting to be lifted right from under me. But Colt was the kind of fool who drew sweeping conclusions from surface-level details. He'd spotted a faded corporate logo and a dusty filing cabinet and decided he understood everything about how I operated. He had no idea what Warehouse 42 actually was. There wasn't a single piece of scrap metal inside that building. No secret stockpile of retired aerospace components. No unregistered industrial platinum stacked on wooden pallets waiting to be moved through a syndicate fence. The manifest I'd left sitting out in my study was pure deliberate fiction from start to finish. Warehouse 42 held no salvage, but calling it abandoned would be dead wrong. 5 years back, the Industrial Zoning Board had come to me quietly with a proposition that was both enormously profitable and completely off the books. My main scrapyard sat on prime, easily reached industrial land, but Warehouse 42 was a different animal, isolated at the far end of a dead-end service road, hemmed in by solid concrete barriers and a long disused rail line. An eyesore to anyone passing by, but a tactical goldmine for any operation that needed airtight privacy and serious security. I leased the full structure along with the surrounding 3 acres to Federal Armored Transport. They are the top-tier logistics contractors who manage and physically move enormous volumes of currency on behalf of the central banking system. From the street, the facility reads exactly like a long-forgotten relic of some dead industrial era. I kept it that way on purpose. The corrugated steel roof is streaked with heavy rust. The massive sliding bay doors look warped and permanently seized. The chain-link perimeter fence is allowed to run wild with thick, thorny growth. It's a carefully constructed piece of urban camouflage designed to make eyes slide right past it. Step inside, though, and Warehouse 42 is an entirely different world. Behind those corroded steel doors is a heavily fortified military-grade staging ground. The concrete walls have been reinforced with thick steel plating built to absorb explosive breaches. Thermal imaging drones sweep the roof, and seismic sensors run through the subterranean foundation. When the central banks need to move massive pallets of physical currency across the region, they don't park armored vehicles in ordinary commercial lots. They route them into secure, impenetrable hubs like this one to transfer loads and cycle through heavily armed security rotations. The building runs on a network of silent federal alarms tied directly to regional law enforcement dispatch and the Bureau. The main floor is threaded with invisible motion lasers that fire the instant the outer perimeter is crossed. On top of all that, a permanent tactical unit of highly trained, heavily armed federal guards holds the control room around the clock every hour of every day. These are not men carrying standard sidearms. They carry military assault rifles, and they are cleared to deploy lethal force against any unauthorized individual who attempts to access the currency vaults. I sat quietly in the cab of my truck, a slow, grim smile working its way across my face as I pictured the magnificent disaster Colt was busy engineering for himself. He was out there right now, persuading a dangerous syndicate of violent loan sharks to assemble a professional robbery crew. He was feeding them stolen coordinates, selling them on a soft target, an oblivious old man, and a few rusty padlocks, standing between them and a fortune. He was about to march heavily armed thugs straight into the teeth of a supreme federal stronghold. By breaching Warehouse 42 Colt, Riker wasn't simply pulling off a burglary. He wasn't just robbing his wealthy father-in-law to cover his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. He was launching a direct aggressive assault on a highly classified Federal Reserve staging facility. The moment he and his hired muscle pushed through those rusted exterior doors, the silent alarms would trip. They would immediately face a wall of motion lasers and a tactical response team that didn't stop to ask polite questions. Colt was about to commit a Class A federal felony. There would be no clever maneuvering, no smooth-talking his way clear of a holding cell, no high-priced defense attorney with enough pull to shield him from the full crushing weight of federal prosecution. The government doesn't cut deals with people who try to raid central banking transport hubs. They bury them under decades of mandatory minimum sentences in maximum security penitentiaries. He'd been chasing the ultimate score to fund his escape to Dubai, and what I was actually handing him was a one-way ticket to federal prison. He had coldly written off my daughter, leaving her to sink with her bankrupt flower shop without a moment's concern for the wreckage, financial and emotional, he was walking away from. Now he would be the one left to rot, surrounded by iron bars and the very criminals he'd been stupid enough to double-cross. The trap was flawlessly constructed, utterly inescapable, and set to slam shut the second he made his move. I turned the key, took in the steady, reassuring rumble of the engine, and pulled slowly away from the curb. The countdown was now officially running. I had given him exactly 72 hours to hang himself with the rope I'd handed him. Every piece was in place on the board. I intended to savor every last second of his spectacular, undeniable collapse. He had dared to come at my family banking on the idea that I was weak and oblivious. He was about to discover that real power moves in silence and only strikes when the outcome is already decided. Those 72 hours crawled by with the grinding slowness of a lit fuse. Throughout those 3 days, I watched Colt move with a frantic, unsettling efficiency. He spent long stretches locked inside the guest room, conducting hushed phone calls and ironing out the logistics of his grand betrayal. He kept Lacey pacified with a steady stream of polished lies, assuring her that his sudden late-night absences were nothing more than the final hurdles before a massive venture capital deal came through. Lacey took every word at face value. That Friday evening, Colt announced he had an unavoidable after-hours dinner with an international investor. He kissed her on the cheek and drove off to coordinate a violent robbery. I gave it exactly 2 hours after he left. At 1:45, I walked into the living room, where Lacey was curled up on the sofa with a book. I told her to get her coat. I told her we needed to take a drive. She looked up at me, brow creased in genuine confusion. She pointed toward the grandfather clock in the hallway, noted the hour, and objected that she was already dressed for bed. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't leave room for argument. I simply told her I had found something that belonged to her mother, something important involving Lorene and her old neighborhood, and I needed her to see it tonight. The mention of her mother was the only thing that could get past her resistance. Lacey sighed, set her book down with a small groan, and pulled a heavy wool coat over her shoulders. She followed me out to the driveway and settled into the passenger seat of my truck. The drive passed in a thick, pressing silence. Lacey stared out the window as we left the clean, well-kept lawns of our quiet suburb behind. The smooth residential asphalt gave way to the cracked, uneven roads of the industrial district. Bright streetlights thinned out and disappeared, replaced by stuttering lamps, throwing a yellow wash over the deteriorating landscape. Lacey shifted uneasily in her seat. She asked where we were headed, her earlier annoyance edging into something closer to anxiety. I kept my gaze straight ahead on the road. I told her to be patient. I told her that some things can only be understood when you're standing in the dark. I steered through the maze of shuttered factories without a second's hesitation. This was my world, built on rust, sweat, and hard work that Colt had assumed he could waltz in and plunder. I turned down a narrow service road, flanked by high walls of corrugated metal and crumbling brick. I cut the headlights, letting the truck roll silently through the deep shadows until we reached a concealed alleyway. I brought it to a stop and shifted into park. The engine idled with a low, steady hum, the only sound in the wasteland. Lacey peered through the window, her eyes working to adjust to the darkness. She looked across at the massive, decaying structure, looming directly opposite our hidden position. It was Warehouse 42. From where we sat tucked in the dark alley, the building had the look of a forgotten tomb. The exterior was layered in decades of grime. The chain-link fencing was choked with dead weeds, and the enormous bay doors appeared sealed shut by rust and time. Lacey turned toward me, her face drained of color in the faint glow of the dashboard. She wanted to know why I dragged her to a condemned scrapyard in the dead of night. She asked what any of this could possibly have to do with her mother. I let the question hang in the air. I reached into my thick leather briefcase sitting on the center console. I pulled out my silver iPad, the very same device Colt had been so eager to photograph just 3 days before. I tapped the screen to wake it bypass my personal email and opened the encrypted software tied to the security network of Warehouse 42. The display blazed to life, flooding the dark cabin with a sharp blue-white light. I split the screen into a 4-panel grid. 2 panels carried the high-definition infrared exterior feeds covering the front gates and the loading dock. The other 2 showed the warehouse interior, a pristine, brightly lit military-grade staging ground that Colt had absolutely no knowledge of. I turned to my daughter and looked straight into her confused, frightened eyes. I told her the man she had married was no venture capitalist. I told her his entire firm was nothing but a rented post office box and that he had burned through his full inheritance in a catastrophic financial gamble. I watched the color leave her face entirely as I laid it out. Plainly, her husband was currently $2 million in debt to a violent loan shark syndicate. I didn't cushion any of it. I told her that Colt had been quietly draining money from her floral boutique for the past 8 months, deliberately steering her business toward forced bankruptcy, just to service the minimum interest on his massive hidden debts. Lacey opened her mouth ready to push back, to deny every word to defend the man she'd built her life around. But nothing came out. She could see the absolute unshakable certainty sitting behind my eyes. She knew me well enough to understand I wouldn't construct a lie of this scale. I held the glowing iPad out toward her, my hand rock steady. I told her that Colt had broken into my private study. I told her he had found a fabricated inventory manifest listing $15 million in untraceable platinum stored inside the exact warehouse we were sitting outside of right now. I explained that he had turned that false information over to his criminal creditors, trading it for a heist deal that would clear his debts and put him on a plane out of the country. Lacey stared at the screen, breathing in shallow, uneven pulls. She looked back up at the rusted shell of the building across the street, her mind struggling to reconcile that rotting exterior with the high-tech, heavily armed operation displayed on the tablet. I told her Warehouse 42 was not a scrapyard. I told her it was a highly classified federal armored transport hub used to stage central banking currency. I told her it was threaded with silent federal alarms and motion lasers, and that a tactical team carrying military assault rifles was stationed inside at all times. I pressed the iPad gently into her trembling hands. I told her to keep her eyes on the screen. I told her that the mandatory dinner meeting Colt had claimed to be attending was in fact a rendezvous with a violent robbery crew. I told her that within the next few minutes, she was going to watch her husband try to breach a federal stronghold. She was going to watch the illusion break apart and finally see the real thing hiding behind the mask. I rested my hand softly over hers and said nothing more. The trap was set. The silence inside the truck was suffocating a thick, unspoken dread that seemed to press down on everything. Lacey sat motionless beside me, her wide eyes fixed on the glowing screen of the silver iPad on the center console. She was holding her breath, quietly pleading with whatever force she believed in that I was simply a paranoid old man who'd gotten it all wrong. I could feel the faint, terrible tremors moving through her small hand where it rested under mine. The infrared cameras sweeping the desolate exterior of Warehouse 42 showed a haunting landscape rendered entirely in shades of gray and pale white. The heavy rusted chain-link fence read like a solid wall of bleached bone in the crisp digital feed. The agonizing minutes passed with a heavy leaden weight that made the air itself feel hard to draw in. Each tick of the digital dashboard clock landed like a dull blow against my chest. I knew exactly how desperately my daughter needed me to be wrong tonight. She wanted the charming man she had chosen to be sitting at a late-night business dinner with wealthy international investors in some bright upscale downtown restaurant. She needed her fragile dream to hold together. But a beautiful dream, built on a rotting foundation of deliberate, calculated lies, will always give way, and when it does, the collapse is never soft. I kept my eyes on the screen, my face set like concrete, and waited for the desperate rat to step into the maze I had laid out for him. At exactly 12:14 in the morning, a sweep of bright headlights cut across the cracked asphalt of the dark service road. Lacey let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her trembling fingers pressing hard into the leather of the armrest. A dark, unmarked cargo van crept to a slow, deliberate stop just beyond the reach of the nearest streetlight. It sat exactly 50 yards from the perimeter gates of the silent warehouse. The metal side door scraped open, and 3 figures stepped into the harsh infrared glare of my hidden security network. They moved in tight, predatory unison. 2 of them were enormous, broad-shouldered men, dressed head to toe in dark tactical gear. Each carried a heavy assault rifle slung across his chest, without any effort to conceal it. The 3rd figure was noticeably slighter, dressed in a sharp-tailored dark designer suit that looked almost absurd against the ruined industrial backdrop. It was Colt. He was gripping a large pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters in his right hand. Lacey physically recoiled against the passenger door, pressing herself back as if she could disappear into it. A strangled, broken sob tore from her throat as she stared at the feed. There was no mistaking what she was seeing. There was no charming explanation left that could cover this. The man she loved, the man who had sworn to protect her, was standing in a filthy, deserted alley with armed mercenaries preparing to break into a classified federal transport hub. I reached over and tapped the audio icon in the bottom corner of the iPad screen. I patched the parabolic security microphones from the exterior cameras directly into the truck's speakers. A brief burst of static hiss filled the cabin, and then it gave way to crystal-clear audio streaming in from the street outside. We could hear the hard crunch of loose gravel under heavy combat boots. We could hear the rhythmic metallic clink of tactical gear shifting in the cold night air. And then we heard Colt's voice completely stripped of every smooth, polished, manipulative layer he'd ever used. He sounded frantic. He sounded greedy. He sounded ruthless in a way that left no room for doubt. "We're going to cut the main steel chain on the front perimeter gate," Colt told the armed men, gesturing toward the rusted entrance. "The old man is a complete fool. He relies entirely on heavy padlocks and outdated deadbolts to protect his fortune. There are no exterior cameras and no electronic security of any kind on this outer fence. Once we're inside the main yard, I have the exact combination to open the secondary loading bay door." The massive loan shark standing beside him let out a low, threatening grunt, one hand resting on the rifle across his chest. "We better not be walking into some kind of setup, Riker." The man's voice was a rough, dangerous rumble that moved through the truck's speakers and settled in the bones. "If this building comes up empty, you're not walking back out of this alley tonight." Colt scoffed a cold, arrogant sound that made Lacey flinch in her seat. "It's not empty," he replied, his voice climbing with undisguised, sickening greed. "I saw the confidential inventory manifest with my own eyes. The platinum is stacked right inside the primary holding bay. We load the pallets straight into the back of the van, and we're gone before the sun comes up." The second armed thug stepped forward, pressing a heavy-gloved hand against the rusted chain-link fence. "What about your wife?" he asked, almost casually, glancing over at Colt. "You certain she's not going to call the police the minute you don't come home tonight? A full missing persons investigation brings heat we don't need right now." Colt didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. What came out of his mouth next flowed with an effortless, monstrous ease that turned my stomach. "Once we grab the platinum, I'm gone," Colt said flatly, his voice carrying clean and cold through the dark cabin of my truck. "Block Lacey's number. She has no clue what's happening. Let the dumb broad rot with her bankrupt flower shop." The silence inside the vehicle was total. Lacey stared at the screen, every drop of color gone from her face. The perfect illusion she had clung to for so long shattered in an instant beyond any possibility of repair. She let out a long, agonizing wail and folded forward her shoulders, shaking with deep, uncontrollable sobs. I reached across the console without a word and wrapped my arms around my daughter. "I made a promise to your mother that no man would ever destroy your life and walk away from it," I whispered, holding her tight. We sat together in the suffocating dark. After a time, Lacey slowly pulled back from my chest. The tears had stopped, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness that had moved into her eyes and settled there. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned her gaze back to the glowing screen, then out through the windshield at the decaying structure across the street. We watched in complete silence as the 3 men advanced on the main entrance of Warehouse 42 with practiced, methodical precision. Colt moved with a swaggering, false confidence, certain of his own manufactured brilliance. The 2 mercenaries flanked him on either side, their heavy boots pressing softly into the gravel. Colt stopped at the front gate. The thick chain wrapped around the rusted iron fence looked formidable, but it was nothing more than window dressing. He raised the bolt cutters and locked the steel jaws onto the center link. He put his full body weight behind the handles. A sharp metallic crack rang out through the alley, picked up cleanly by the parabolic microphones, and fed directly into the truck's speakers. The chain dropped to the dirt. Colt shoved the gate open. It let out a long, grinding shriek of ungreased metal. The armed men swept the empty perimeter rifles, raised completely oblivious to the fact that multiple high-definition thermal cameras were tracking every movement, every heartbeat in real time. They covered the 50 yards of cracked weed splits concrete. Colt led them toward the massive corrugated loading bay door, the spot he was convinced held his salvation. He fished his smartphone from the breast pocket of his tailored suit. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was reviewing the photographs he'd stolen from my study, staring at the fabricated access codes I had built specifically for him. He stepped up to the rusted keypad mounted on the brick wall beside the door and punched in the sequence with eager, trembling fingers. A deep hydraulic clunk rolled up from somewhere inside the building's belly. The massive steel door began grinding slowly upward on its industrial tracks, dragging against the concrete. Colt stepped forward with a victor's confidence, a wide smile crossing his face. He was expecting to walk into a dark, quiet space, stacked floor to ceiling, with wooden pallets of raw platinum and untraceable rhodium. He expected to find his way out. He crossed the threshold, his expensive leather shoes passing through the invisible plane of the motion lasers. The response was instantaneous and total. The trap didn't simply spring, it detonated. Before Colt could take a second step, massive banks of military-grade floodlights ignited all at once across the entire perimeter of the yard. The sudden blaze converted the pitch-black night into a blinding artificial noon. The light was so fierce and immediate that Lacey and I had to throw our hands up to shield our eyes. A heartbeat later, the bone-rattling wail of a federal emergency siren erupted from the warehouse rooftop. A physical force, a rhythmic shriek engineered to disorient and paralyze every person within range. On the security screen, Colt froze solid. The victorious smile vanished from his face, replaced by raw, undisguised panic. He dropped his smartphone onto the concrete and threw his arms up to block the blinding light. The two mercenaries behind him instinctively raised their rifles, their training firing before their minds could catch up, scanning desperately for targets in the chaos. But their experience also told them something their training couldn't override. They recognized immediately what they had walked into. This was no poorly guarded scrapyard. They had stepped directly into a heavily fortified federal stronghold. Heavy steel tactical doors burst open on every side of the warehouse yard. Dozens of heavily armored federal guards poured out into the glaring light, moving with terrifying speed and absolute military precision, locking down a tight, inescapable perimeter around all three intruders. They weren't carrying sidearms. They carried high-powered, short-barreled assault rifles, and every weapon was up and locked on target. A booming, amplified voice cut through the wailing siren from a loudspeaker overhead. "Federal armored transport. Drop your weapons immediately or you will be shot. Do it now." The mercenaries were violent men, but they weren't suicidal. They understood in an instant that they were outgunned and completely cornered. Without a moment's hesitation, both men let their rifles fall to the concrete, laced their fingers behind their heads, and dropped to their knees. They knew full well what the penalty was for threatening a federal transport detail. Colt, however, came completely apart. The polished calculating operator simply ceased to exist. The man who had coolly planned to abandon his wife to violent loan sharks was reduced in seconds to a trembling hollow shell. He dropped the bolt cutters, they clattered hard against the pavement, and his legs gave out beneath him entirely. He didn't kneel. He collapsed, going straight down onto the cold, wet ground, landing squarely in a shallow puddle of muddy water. Dozens of red laser sights immediately swept across his chest, dancing over the lapels of his expensive suit. His arms shot into the air, his whole body racked with violent shaking. He began to cry, not quietly, not with any shred of composure. It was a loud, hysterical, humiliating wail of absolute terror. Through the high-definition audio feed, Lacey and I could hear him begging, frantically screaming, that it was all a terrible mistake, that he was just a businessman looking for his father-in-law. The federal guards paid his pleas no attention. 4 heavily armored officers moved in fast, driving Colt face down into the mud. They wrenched his arms behind his back and locked his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. I watched the dark stains spread across the front of his tailored trousers. When confronted with actual immediate consequence, Colt Riker had lost all control. He was lying in the mud, weeping like a frightened child, while federal agents took away his freedom. I turned to look at my daughter. Lacey was staring at the iPad screen, utterly fixed on the pitiful, degrading scene playing out on the concrete. There was no pity in her expression, no trace of love or tenderness for the man sobbing in the mud. The carefully constructed illusion he had maintained for 2 years was broken beyond any hope of recovery. She was seeing him as he actually was, a small, cowardly man who had promised to cherish her forever and meant none of it. Lacey reached over slowly and closed the cover of the iPad, cutting off the feed. She let out a long, slow breath, like she was releasing something she hadn't known she'd been holding for years. She looked at me, her face lit softly by the distant glow of the warehouse floodlights. Her eyes were clear. Morning light stretched in pale gold ribbons across the polished granite countertops of my kitchen. The house was deeply quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of federal sirens and screaming men that had filled the night before. I stood at the coffee maker, listening to the steady drip of liquid filling the glass carafe. Lacey sat at the kitchen island, both hands curled around a warm ceramic mug. She was pale and visibly worn, but the grinding tension that had lived in her shoulders for 2 years was gone. The devastating fiction of her perfect marriage had been torn away, and what it left behind was a clean, hard clarity. We hadn't spoken much since driving back from the industrial district. There was no need for speeches or emotional declarations. She had seen the unvarnished truth with her own eyes, and that truth had cut clean through every toxic chain Colt had wound around her life. I poured myself a cup of strong black coffee, took in the bitter, grounding aroma, and turned to face my daughter. I was about to ask what she wanted for breakfast when her phone broke the quiet. It buzzed hard against the granite, the ringtone cutting sharply through the stillness of the kitchen. Lacey flinched, her eyes moving to the glowing screen. She stared at the unfamiliar out-of-state number, flashing on repeat. A shadow of apprehension crossed her face. She reached out slowly and accepted the call, pressing the phone to speaker and setting it flat on the counter between us. A cold, mechanical, utterly emotionless voice filled the room. "This is a collect call from the county correctional facility. An inmate has requested to speak with you. If you wish to accept the charges, press 1 now." Lacey looked up at me, her eyes wide. I gave her one firm nod. She pressed 1. The automated voice clicked away, replaced by the muffled, echoing noise of a crowded holding block. And then we heard Colt. "Lacey, please tell me you're there." His voice was a high, desperate, pitiful whine. He was sobbing in broken bursts, his words stumbling over each other in a panicked rush. "You have to listen to me. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was just driving past your father's old warehouse, and these armed men came out of nowhere. The police arrested me by mistake. They've got me locked in a cell with violent criminals. Lacey, it's terrifying in here. You have to call my lawyer right now. You have to drain the business accounts and post my bail today. They're talking about federal charges, but it's all completely false. You have to get me out of here." I listened to the sniveling coward feeding his fabricated story through the speaker. Even now, sitting behind steel bars and staring down decades of prison time, he was still working to manipulate his wife. He was still trying to use her as a convenient way out of the consequences his own bottomless greed had produced. The night before, he had coolly plotted to hand her over to ruthless loan sharks. Now, he was begging her to empty her struggling flower shop accounts to buy back his freedom. The sheer audacity of his narcissism was almost staggering. I watched Lacey carefully. A single tear slid down her cheek, but her expression didn't yield to pity. Her face closed into something harder, a mask of pure, clear revulsion. She opened her mouth to respond, to let loose every bit of righteous anger she had every right to feel. But I laid my hand gently over hers and shook my head. This was no longer her burden to carry. The final word belonged to me. I picked the phone up from the counter and brought it to my ear. I drew a slow breath and let the cold, steady resolve settle fully into my voice before I spoke. "Hello, Colt," I said. My tone was flat and unyielding as the poured concrete. The frantic sobbing on the other end stopped dead. The silence that followed was so complete I could almost feel his pulse spiking through the connection. When he finally found his voice, it came out as a shaking, barely audible whisper. "Gerald." He breathed the word like a man who'd just been struck. "Where is Lacey?" Why do you have her phone? I want to speak to my wife right now. Lacey is right here beside me, I replied, taking a measured sip of my coffee. And she has absolutely nothing left to say to you. She's done listening to your lies. We had quite an illuminating evening. Colt took a scenic drive down to the industrial district, parked in a dark alley across from a certain rundown building, and watched a very entertaining show play out on my security feed. We watched you walk up to a federal transport hub full of confidence, and we watched you cry like a frightened child when the tactical team put your face into the mud. There was a sharp, strangled breath from the other end of the line. You were there. Colt choked the words out, his voice climbing with panic. You set me up. You faked that whole inventory manifest. You walked me straight into a trap. I didn't set you up, I answered smoothly, feeling a deep and satisfying warmth settle in my chest. I simply held up a beautifully crafted mirror, and you eagerly showed me the monstrous reflection of your own bottomless greed. You wanted to steal my legacy. You wanted to feed my daughter to violent criminals so you could slip out of the country clean. You wanted my warehouse, son. You got it. But you didn't break into a clueless old man's abandoned scrapyard. You didn't find $15 million in unregistered platinum sitting there waiting for you. You broke directly into a highly classified federal cash staging facility. You coordinated an armed assault on a United States banking transport stronghold. The men you brought were carrying illegal assault rifles. You triggered a level 4 federal response. Gerald, please! Colt's voice shattered into high, hysterical sobs. You have to tell them the truth. You have to help me. Please. I let out a short, cold laugh, a sound with no warmth anywhere in it. I'm not going to help you, Colt, I said. Enjoy your 25-year federal sentence without parole. You are a ghost to us. Colt screamed. I pressed the red button, cut him off completely, and blocked the number for good. The morning sun was shining bright and clean. The nightmare was over, and our family was finally free. Exactly 1 month after that night, the cloud that had pressed down on our family for so long finally lifted. Colt was sitting in an isolation cell inside a maximum security federal detention center, waiting on a very public federal trial. The ruthless loan shark syndicate he had tried to double-cross was indicted right alongside him. A federal judge had looked at the mountain of evidence and denied bail without hesitation, declaring him an extreme flight risk. He wasn't going anywhere. He would eventually trade his tailored designer suits for a prison jumpsuit, and the man who had believed himself untouchable would become nothing more than a forgotten number serving a long, hard sentence. On a clear and beautiful Thursday morning, I drove my daughter into the heart of the city. Lacey rode comfortably in the passenger seat. Her color was fully restored, her posture carrying a quiet, settled strength, and the dark circles that had lived under her eyes for so long were completely gone. The divorce proceedings were already moving with impressive speed, surgically removing Colt from her life for good. We parked outside a towering glass building and rode a silent elevator straight to the top floor. Alistair Dunphy, my most trusted corporate attorney, and one of the most steadfast allies my family has ever had, was waiting inside his broad corner office. Lacey settled into a plush leather armchair and looked over at me with a curious, questioning expression. I crossed the room and sat down beside her. I reached into my coat pocket and drew out a small velvet pouch. I opened it and set a single heavy brass key down on the polished walnut desk between us. Lacey stared at it, completely puzzled. She asked what it was, for her voice soft in the quiet room. I smiled, covering her hand with mine. I told her that a man who spends his life building an empire out of jagged scrap metal learns to keep his most valuable things where no one will ever think to look. I explained that Colt had made the mistake of assuming my wealth was sitting inside a rusted warehouse or exposed in ordinary bank accounts. But Colt was a superficial creature who never grasped the depth of a father's instinct to protect what matters most. I nodded toward Alistair, who placed a thick leather-bound portfolio in Lacey's hands. I told her to open it. Her fingers turned the heavy pages slowly. She stared at the legal documents, her eyes moving over the substantial figures printed in bold black ink. I explained that years ago, shortly before her mother passed, we had quietly established an ironclad blind trust, held entirely in her name. The real wealth, the full weight of everything I had built over a lifetime of hard work, was legally insulated. It was shielded behind layers of airtight corporate law, and completely beyond the reach of any greedy, manipulative spouse. That brass key opened a private vault holding physical bearer bonds and certified asset deeds that belonged to her and her alone. Colt had spent 2 years chasing a hidden fortune he never had any legal right to touch. Tears of deep, overwhelming gratitude spilled down Lacey's cheeks. She rose from her chair and threw her arms around my neck, pressing her face into my shoulder. I held her close, feeling the bond between a father and his daughter restored whole and unbroken. She kept thanking me, but I told her that keeping her safe was the greatest privilege of my life. Later that week, Lacey officially reopened her floral boutique. With the suffocating weight of Colt's secret financial drain lifted for good, the business began to breathe and grow almost immediately. She brought on 2 new assistants to handle the surge of customer orders, and her warm, joyful laughter rang out again through the fragrant, color-filled shop. She was taking her life back. That Sunday evening, I sat alone on the solid wooden porch of my house as the quiet settled in around me. The late afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, spreading a rich golden warmth across the neat green lawn. I held a crystal glass filled with rich amber scotch. The air was incredibly peaceful, devoid of the chaotic tension that had poisoned our lives for so long. I took a slow sip, letting the smooth heat move through my chest. I looked out at the wide painted sky and felt something settle gently over me, a presence quiet and certain. I smiled and raised my glass in a slow, silent toast. I kept my promise, Lorene. I whispered into the evening air, my voice steady with conviction. Nobody takes what is ours. Greed is a blinding poison. It makes arrogant men believe they are sharper than everyone around them. But when you try to use a family's love as a tool to fill your own pockets, you end up building the walls of your own inescapable cell. True wealth isn't found in secret warehouses, stolen accounts, or carefully constructed lies. It's built through decades of honest labor, fierce loyalty, and the unshakable instinct of a father who will always defend what is his. Never underestimate a quiet man who spent his whole life forging an empire out of nothing but scrap. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. Truly, stories like this one don't come easy to tell and they don't come easy to hear, but they need to be told. Looking back on everything that unfolded, the deception, the planning, the long nights watching someone I had welcomed into my family try to tear it apart, I won't pretend it didn't cost me something. It cost me the illusion that love alone is enough to protect the people you die for. But I believe God put certain trials in front of a man, not to break him, but to remind him of exactly what he was built for. The Lord's timing on all of it was something I could never have engineered on my own. If there's anything these father stories leave behind, let it be this. Never let a man's smooth words carry more weight than his consistent actions. What someone does in the dark will always tell you more than what they say in the light. If you sense someone is draining the people you love quietly, carefully over time, trust that instinct. A slow bleed can be just as deadly as a sudden wound. Protect what matters most before the threat makes itself known. A father's real work is done in the quiet years, not just in the crisis. And remember, the kind of dad's revenge worth having is not loud, not reckless, and not cruel. It is patient, thorough, and entirely just. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight, a parent, a friend, anyone who knows what it means to protect the people they love. And if you haven't already subscribed to His Hidden Revenge so you never miss a story. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.